The moment the steel door rolled upward, a smell of turpentine and dust poured out like breath from a long-sealed tomb. Harold and Margaret stood frozen before the dim interior, their flashlight beams sliding over stacks of framed canvases leaning in crooked rows against the concrete walls. Every inch of the unit, floor to ceiling, was filled with paintings. Not boxes, not furniture, not antiques. Just paintings. Hundreds of them. For an instant, neither of them spoke. Margaret's gloved hands stayed on the chain of the door, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "Well," she murmured at last, "this is either the worst gamble we've ever made, or the luckiest." They had paid $640 for the unit that morning, one of those blind auctions where you get 10 seconds to peek inside before you decide. The storage manager had lifted the door just a few inches, and all they'd seen was the edge of a gold-painted frame and the corner of a rolled canvas. It had been enough to make Harold raise his hand. After months of empty retirement checks barely covering the bills, the idea of one last little adventure, one last risk, had seemed harmless. Now, as light from the corridor spilled inside, they realized this wasn't an artist's leftovers. This was an entire lifetime boxed behind a metal door. Each frame carried its own layer of dust. Some had names scribbled on masking tape, others were unsigned, their brushwork delicate and purposeful. A half-finished portrait leaned against the far wall, the eyes of the figure left blank, as though waiting for someone to return and complete them. Harold ran a hand through his thinning hair, unsure whether to feel thrilled or terrified. He had imagined tools, maybe old equipment they could resell at a flea market. Paintings meant a different kind of gamble. Art could be worthless or priceless, and there was rarely an in-between. The light caught one large canvas near the entrance. An ocean scene, dark and moody, the kind of painting that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at it. Margaret knelt down and brushed a finger along the lower corner, revealing a signature under the grime. Wells. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the confident sweep of the letters sent a small thrill up her spine. She straightened, looked at Harold, and smiled the way she hadn't in months. "Let's get them home before anyone else realizes what we found." The drive back to their small house outside Ashford was quiet. Rain clouds rolled low across the horizon, and every bump in the road made the frames in the back of the truck rattle softly, like bones shifting in a coffin. Margaret held the inventory list on her lap, a page she'd scribbled herself, marking down numbers and quick notes: storm at sea, portrait, still life with fruit, cathedral at night. She'd filled half a page before realizing she'd stopped breathing. They'd never planned to chase money. For 30 years Harold had fixed clocks, and she'd worked at the town library. But when his shop closed and her pension checks shrank, they'd begun watching online auctions, half out of boredom, half out of fear of fading away. Storage units offered a strange kind of hope, the fantasy that buried among other people's forgotten things might be a small miracle waiting for them. When they pulled into the driveway, the clouds finally broke. Harold jumped out first, pulling a tarp over the truck bed as rain began to fall in steady silver lines. Margaret hurried to open the garage. Inside, the light was dim, smelling faintly of oil and old wood. They began unloading carefully, setting each painting upright against the walls. One by one, the colors emerged from under layers of grime. Bold reds, deep blues, strange swirling shapes that didn't quite fit into realism or abstraction. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that whoever had painted them hadn't been a hobbyist. There was consistency, intention, a single vision across every brushstroke. Margaret stepped back and whispered, almost to herself, "It feels like we shouldn't even be touching these." Harold chuckled softly, trying to hide the unease creeping into his chest. "We paid for them fair and square. If someone didn't want them sold, they should have paid their rent." But the words rang hollow even to him. By evening, the garage looked like a small museum. Nearly 50 paintings stood against the walls, another dozen still in the truck. Harold went inside to make tea, while Margaret lingered near one large frame she'd just finished wiping clean. It showed a woman seated by a window, hands folded, her face turned away from the viewer. The light from outside fell across her hair, a silver so pale it almost shimmered. Margaret's throat tightened. The woman in the painting could have been her, 20 years ago. Same shape of shoulders, same delicate fingers resting quietly on her lap. She reached out and brushed the edge of the frame. The varnish was smooth beneath her fingertips, the texture strangely warm. When Harold returned with 2 mugs, she didn't move. "Look at this one," she said softly. He set the tea down and leaned closer, squinting. The resemblance struck him too, though he didn't want to say it aloud. "It's beautiful," he said instead. "It's odd." Margaret hesitated. "What are the chances?" "Coincidence," he said quickly, though a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. They stood there for a long time, watching the rain blur the edges of the window, listening to the steady patter against the roof. The garage light flickered once, then steadied again. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and slow, as if something vast had just turned in its sleep. Margaret sipped her tea, gaze fixed on the woman in the painting. "Do you ever wonder," she said finally, "how much of a person stays behind in the things they leave?" Harold didn't answer. He just looked at the row of silent faces staring out from their frames and felt, for the first time that day, the weight of what they might have truly opened. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It came and went in waves, soft and persistent, as if the sky itself refused to look away from what they had brought home. Harold and Margaret spent those days in the garage, moving slowly between the paintings, cataloging each one, trying to bring a small order to the chaos. The concrete floor was lined with old blankets to protect the frames, and the air was thick with the mingled scent of oil paint, mildew, and damp wood. The sound of dripping water from a corner pipe became a kind of metronome, steady and hypnotic, measuring the hours they lost inside that strange gallery. Margaret began noticing something odd by the second evening. The signature, the Wells, appeared again and again, not just on 1 or 2 pieces, but on almost every canvas that had survived the years intact. The strokes of the initials were confident, identical, as though the painter had written them in a single breath. The repetition unsettled her. It meant these weren't random leftovers from an estate sale. They were a collection, deliberate, personal, and unified under one name. Yet neither she nor Harold could recall ever hearing of that artist. There were no books, no online listings, no mentions in the town's art records. It was as if Wells had never existed. The more Margaret cleaned, the more she felt the presence of someone else in the room, not physically, but in the way the light fell across the canvases, in the patterns of color that repeated themselves like a language she almost understood. By the 3rd day, Harold decided to contact the local auction house in town. They specialized in estate evaluations and might be able to identify whether Wells was known or not. He photographed a few of the paintings, including the ocean scene and the portrait of the woman by the window. The email he sent was short, practical, without any hint of the unease that had begun to grow between them. For the rest of the day, he avoided checking for replies. Margaret, however, found it harder to ignore the feeling that had settled deep inside her chest, the sense that these paintings were watching her as much as she was studying them. Each time she turned off the garage light at night, she could swear the woman in the portrait appeared a fraction closer to the window, her head tilted slightly more toward the viewer. It was the kind of thought she immediately dismissed, yet it returned each time she tried to sleep. On the 4th morning, while Harold was making coffee, a new email arrived. It was from a curator named Thomas Alden at the County Historical Museum. His message was polite but cautious. He confirmed that the name A.R. Wells had appeared once before, attached to an exhibition that was planned but never held, sometime in the late 1970s. According to museum archives, the artist had lived in the area briefly before disappearing under unclear circumstances. The collection had been thought lost or destroyed in a warehouse fire. Margaret read the message twice before showing it to Harold. The coincidence was too close to ignore. Their storage unit, according to the receipt, had been rented out continuously for nearly 40 years, exactly long enough to hide something that should have been gone. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Someone had paid faithfully for decades to keep these paintings sealed away, and only in the last few months had the payment stopped. That evening they returned to the garage together, flashlights in hand. The rain had finally thinned to mist, and the silence inside the unit felt heavier than before. Margaret found a small crate they hadn't opened yet, its lid nailed shut and the edges covered in dust so thick it looked like ash. Inside, wrapped in brittle newspaper, lay a stack of sketchbooks, their pages warped but intact. She opened the first one carefully. The sketches were rough but powerful. Faces, hands, landscapes, all drawn with the same deliberate motion. And there, at the bottom of the second page, was a name written in ink, Anna Ruth Wells. Margaret froze. The initials had always been A.R., but somehow she had assumed it was a man. There was something profoundly intimate about seeing the full name. Anna Ruth. It sounded old-fashioned, almost gentle, not the name of someone meant to vanish. The sketches grew darker as she turned the pages. The lines became more erratic, almost frantic. There were notes scrawled in the margins, fragments of sentences like, "She's still there, by the window," and "The reflection isn't mine anymore." The words made her chest tighten. She closed the sketchbook quickly, tucking it back into the crate, and sat down on an overturned box, trying to steady her breathing. When Harold asked what she had found, she simply said, "Her name." It was all she could manage. That night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret kept seeing the handwriting in her mind, the loops of the letters, the way the ink had bled into the page. She realized she wasn't afraid of what they'd found. What she feared was how much of it already felt familiar. It was as if this Anna Ruth Wells had been painting pieces of a life Margaret herself might have lived, or still could, if she wasn't careful. Before turning out the light, she looked toward the garage window one last time. The motion sensor outside flickered briefly, casting a pale glow across the glass. For just a heartbeat, she thought she saw a figure there, not moving, only watching. Then the light clicked off, and everything went dark. By the end of that week, the storm had passed, leaving the sky clear but strangely pale, as though the color had been rinsed from the world. The grass outside their small house still glistened with rain, and the air carried that quiet stillness that follows days of downpour, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the windows. Inside, Harold and Margaret worked in near wordless rhythm. The paintings had taken over their living space. The garage was full, the hallway lined with frames, and even the dining table had become a makeshift workstation covered in cloths and cleaning rags. It was Margaret who noticed the smallest detail first. On the back of one canvas, a muted landscape with a single house near the horizon, there was a faint pencil sketch of a woman's silhouette, almost invisible under the dust. The handwriting beside it read, "March 14th. She still waits by the window." The line struck her with an odd familiarity, echoing the notes she had seen in the sketchbook. It made her uneasy, as if the painter had been documenting something real, not imagined. Harold dismissed it as artistic eccentricity, but Margaret couldn't let it go. That night, when Harold fell asleep in his chair, she opened the notebook again, tracing each page slowly beneath the soft glow of a reading lamp. There were dozens of unfinished sketches of the same woman, always seated by a window, always turned slightly away, her profile lit by the same fragile light. Sometimes her expression was serene, sometimes haunted. In one corner, Margaret found a rough charcoal drawing of an elderly figure that bore her own likeness so precisely she felt her breath catch. She closed the sketchbook again, almost afraid to touch it. The next morning, she made tea and sat staring at the portrait that had unsettled her from the start, the woman by the window. Something had changed since the day they brought it home. The colors seemed deeper now, the blues darker, the highlights sharper around the silver of the hair. The woman's expression had grown softer, almost resigned, as though aware she was being watched. Margaret leaned closer and noticed something she hadn't before, a reflection painted faintly in the glass of the window. It was blurred, but it could almost be another face. The discovery left her uneasy for hours. Harold, ever the pragmatist, focused on the logistics. The auction house had responded again, this time with cautious excitement. R. Wells, now confirmed as Anna Ruth Wells, had a small but passionate following among collectors of lost American modernists. Her disappearance, decades ago, had become something of a mystery. Rumors claimed she'd fallen ill, others that she'd left her home abruptly, leaving unfinished work behind. Some said her final series, the window paintings, had never been found. Margaret's heart quickened at the words. The window paintings. Every piece they'd uncovered showed a figure near or reflected in a window, each painted from slightly different angles. They weren't just individual works, they were fragments of a single idea, a story told across dozens of canvases. Yet one piece seemed missing, the final one, perhaps the conclusion. As the sun began to set, she sat among the paintings, surrounded by color and silence. The orange light from the window fell across her face in the same way it fell across the faces in the frames. She felt, for the first time, a strange intimacy with the woman she had never met. There was something about Anna Ruth's work that carried loneliness so precisely that it didn't feel painted at all. It felt remembered. The following day, she decided to visit the address listed in the museum's old records. It was only 20 miles from Ashford, a decaying farmhouse that had once been part of a small artist's commune. Harold insisted on coming along, though he admitted he didn't understand why. You can't just drive out to some burned-down property because of a name on a painting, he'd said, but his tone carried more concern than irritation. They drove through quiet countryside, the fields washed pale with winter light. When they reached the site, only the foundation remained. Grass and ivy had swallowed the walls, and the wind moved through the broken stones with a hollow whistle. Margaret walked ahead slowly, boots sinking into the damp soil. Near what might once have been a doorway, she found the outline of an old tile floor, the fragments of blue paint scattered like shards of sky. There was nothing much to see, yet something about the place felt charged, as though every gust of air carried whispers too low to hear. Harold called out for her to be careful, but she barely registered his voice. Near the edge of the ruin stood a collapsed wooden easel, half buried in dirt. Margaret knelt and brushed the soil away. Beneath it was a rusted tin box, sealed but light enough to lift. When she pried it open, the hinges groaned. Inside were several faded letters tied with twine, their paper thin as petals. The top one bore the initials R. W. and was addressed to Wells, returned unopened. The date was from the same month as the sketchbook note, March 1979. She didn't understand how, but her hands trembled. Wells. It was possible it was coincidence. Yet her own name, Margaret, began with the same letter. That night, she laid the letters on the table without opening them. The envelopes felt too personal, too fragile, as though disturbing them might break whatever thin thread connected past to present. But when Harold went to bed, she gave in. The first letter was written in neat, elegant script, describing a house by the sea and the promise of returning once the eyes are finished. The words carried a strange poetry, but also exhaustion, as if written by someone aware their work would outlive them. The final lines made her blood run cold. When the reflection turns toward me, I will know it's time to stop. Margaret set the letter down, her pulse echoing in her ears. She glanced toward the garage door, where the faint outline of the woman by the window hung just beyond the glass. The thought struck her with sudden clarity. What if the final painting wasn't missing at all? What if she had brought it home without realizing it? She rose quietly and stepped into the dark hallway. The motion sensor flicked on with a dim glow, guiding her steps. The portrait waited there in the garage, its surface catching the faintest shimmer of moonlight. For a long moment she stood before it, unable to move. The woman in the painting sat exactly as before, her head tilted toward the unseen light outside the frame. Only now, reflected faintly in the window beside her, Margaret thought she saw the curve of another face, her own. The sound of the rain gutter outside tapping against the house was the only thing breaking the silence. The air smelled faintly of paint again, though she hadn't uncapped a tube in days. She backed away, hand over her mouth, and turned off the light. But in the brief moment before darkness filled the room, she could have sworn that the eyes in the painting, once averted, had finally turned to meet hers. The following days passed in a quiet unease that neither Harold nor Margaret dared name. The house had grown still in an unnatural way. Even the ticking of Harold's old clock, once the steady heartbeat of their home, seemed hesitant, as if time itself was unsure whether to move forward. Outside, the air held the scent of wet earth and autumn decay, the kind that sinks into the fabric of curtains and stays there. Inside, the walls were slowly vanishing behind the rows of framed canvases, each one a silent witness to their lives. Harold spent most of his mornings answering messages from collectors and appraisers, his tone cautious but practical. Some of the offers were modest, others surprisingly high. A few even mentioned that the works resembled a rumored lost series, The Windows of Absence. Each message filled him with a mix of pride and apprehension. If these paintings were truly valuable, they could finally pay off their debts and breathe again. Yet each time he suggested selling one, Margaret found a reason to delay. She insisted they needed to understand the story first, who Anna Ruth Wells really was, why she had vanished, and why the art felt so disturbingly personal. The more she studied the paintings, the more she began to notice patterns invisible to Harold's eye. There were details that repeated across different scenes, a slant of light falling on the same type of chair, a blue vase by the window, a faint outline of a distant shoreline always visible beyond the glass. Even when the subject changed, those small motifs lingered, like echoes of a single space seen from different lifetimes. Margaret kept the letters on her desk beside the sketchbook. Late at night, when Harold slept, she reread them carefully. There were 7 in total. Some were written in despair, others in strange calm. All were addressed to Wells. One mentioned the phrase, "The reflection will finish what I began." Another described the hollow sound in the walls when she breathes. They frightened her, yet she couldn't stop reading. The handwriting felt familiar now, looping, deliberate, with the same rhythm as her own. One morning, while dusting the portrait of the woman by the window, Margaret noticed something that stopped her breath. The reflection in the window, the faint shadow she had thought was her imagination, now seemed clearer. The figure within it was unmistakably her, same hairstyle, same cardigan, same tilt of the head. She stared for a long moment, convincing herself it was only a coincidence of light. But the feeling of being watched had become impossible to dismiss. She tried to tell Harold, but he was too focused on practical matters. He had arranged a visit from an art historian named Lydia Parsons, who was eager to inspect the paintings in person. Margaret didn't object, though the thought of a stranger among them felt intrusive. When Lydia arrived that Friday afternoon, a brisk woman with careful eyes and a quiet, precise voice, she seemed immediately transfixed by the collection. She moved from frame to frame in reverent silence, pausing longest before the portrait of the woman by the window. "This one," she said finally, "was never publicly exhibited. It was believed to be unfinished." Margaret asked how she could tell. The records mentioned that Anna Ruth intended to paint herself reflected in the window, but she never completed it. Lydia's voice softened, almost hesitant. Some say that was her last work before she disappeared. There were rumors she began to believe her reflection wasn't hers anymore. She was found wandering near the coast, repeating that her double had taken her place. The words hung in the air, heavy and uninvited. Harold laughed awkwardly, but Margaret remained still. Something deep inside her chest tightened, as though a string had been pulled too sharply. Lydia continued her examination, noting dates and pigments, but Margaret could barely focus. Her reflection wasn't hers anymore. The phrase echoed like the faint hum inside the garage. That evening, after Lydia left, Harold poured himself a small drink and sat quietly by the kitchen window. "We could sell just one," he said softly, almost to himself. "Just one, to see how the market reacts." Margaret didn't answer. She was standing in the doorway to the garage, staring into the half-light. The reflection in the portrait was gone. The window inside the painting was now empty, showing only the blurred suggestion of trees beyond it. She stepped closer, pressing her hand to the cold glass covering the frame. Her fingers trembled. The surface was dry, yet she could feel a faint vibration beneath it, as if someone were breathing on the other side. That night she dreamt she was sitting by the same window from the portrait, though she couldn't tell whether she was inside the painting or outside of it. The rain fell soundlessly, and beyond the glass she could see another woman mirroring her every movement. When she raised her hand, the figure did the same. But then, slowly, the reflection smiled, not her smile, but something sharper, almost pitying. Margaret woke with a gasp, her nightgown damp with sweat. In the morning, she went straight to the garage. The light coming through the small window was pale and cold. The woman in the portrait still sat motionless, her painted eyes lowered. But Margaret noticed something new, the faint trace of moisture running down the inside of the glass, like a single tear. Harold found her there an hour later, pale and shaking. She told him she must have imagined it, that the damp air was to blame. He believed her, or at least pretended to, though she caught him glancing at the painting more than once afterward, his brow furrowed. The days that followed blurred into each other. The house felt increasingly crowded with the weight of so many silent faces. Margaret began covering some of the canvases with sheets, claiming she wanted to protect them from dust. In truth, she couldn't bear their gaze anymore. Yet every time she turned one around, another seemed to appear somewhere else. A portrait leaning where none had been before, a still life she didn't remember moving. Harold insisted she was overtired, but his voice lacked conviction. One evening, while searching for her glasses, she noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the inside of the painting's glass. Small, slender fingers pressed against the surface, perfectly aligned with her own. She didn't tell Harold that night. She didn't tell him when the letters began to move slightly on her desk, as if stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. Nor when she began hearing a faint tapping from the garage after midnight, slow and rhythmic, like a brush striking canvas. Instead, she told herself that she was simply becoming too involved, that art had a way of drawing you in, blurring boundaries between the creator and the observer. Yet a quiet part of her mind whispered that something inside those frames was not content to stay painted. By the end of the week, Harold received a message from Lydia Parsons. She wanted to return, urgently. She claimed she had found something in the museum's archives that might change everything about the collection. Her tone, even through the short email, carried tension. "It's about the self-portrait," she had written. "I need to see it again before I can explain." Margaret read the message twice, her hand cold around the paper. Outside, dusk had already fallen, and the sky was the same bruised color as the sea in Anna Ruth's storm paintings. Somewhere deep in the house, a faint echo of dripping water marked the rhythm of time, slow, persistent, and growing louder with every hour. She knew, even before Lydia arrived again, that the answer she was bringing would not be the kind that brought peace. By the time Lydia returned, the weather had turned fully to rain, the kind that didn't crash or roar, but simply fell steadily as if the sky had grown tired of holding anything back. Harold and Margaret sat together at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around cooling mugs, listening to the muffled hum of tires passing over wet asphalt. The house felt different now, heavier somehow. It wasn't just the paintings. It was the knowledge that they had crossed a threshold without quite realizing it, from curiosity into something that felt more like responsibility. When the doorbell finally rang, the sound cut through the quiet like a small, polite alarm. Lydia arrived wrapped in a dark coat, her hair damp at the edges, eyes sharper than before. She greeted them with a soft nod, but there was no idle chatter, no pleasantries about the weather. Her briefcase seemed almost too large for her slight frame. As soon as her coat was hung and her umbrella left dripping in the stand, she asked to see the self-portrait again. There was something in her tone that made Margaret's stomach tighten, as if she were bracing not for news, but for confirmation. They led her out to the garage, where the cold air smelled of cement and linseed oil, and the portrait waited on its easel like a quiet judge. Lydia stood before it a long time without speaking. She leaned in close, studying the brushstrokes in the window, the thin glaze over the woman's face, the faint line where background and reflection blurred. Then she opened her briefcase and pulled out 2 plastic sleeves. Inside the first was a faded black and white photograph of a younger woman in a paint-splattered smock, standing beside a canvas. Inside the second was a page from an old catalog, its edges browned, the print slightly blurred. She laid both on a folding table and stepped back. The photograph's caption read, "Anna Ruth Wells in her studio, 1965. The catalog page showed a grainy reproduction of the same self-portrait that now stood before them, but in the printed version, the figure by the window looked slightly different. The face in the reflection was not lowered or turned away. It was raised, looking out, and unmistakably resembled the woman in the photograph. "What does it mean?" Harold asked, though his voice sounded small even to himself. Lydia spoke carefully, choosing her words as though they might shift weight in the room. She explained that the catalog came from a cancelled exhibition. The curator's notes, which she had found in the museum's archive, mentioned that Anna Ruth had insisted on taking the painting back before the show opened. She claimed the work was unfinished in the wrong way. She wrote of feeling her own reflection slipping into the painted one, and of an older woman she kept seeing in the glass, someone who did not yet exist in her life, but who felt inevitable. Shortly after, the exhibition was scrapped, and Anna Ruth's health began to falter. The pamphlet was never widely distributed. Most assumed the painting had been destroyed. Lydia looked from Margaret to the canvas and then away, as if afraid of the conclusion her own research suggested. For a moment, no one spoke. Margaret felt the air around her grow thin, as if the room had shrunk by several inches in every direction. The idea that a woman who had died decades ago might have imagined her face in this painting made her skin prickle. Part of her wanted to reject it outright, to laugh and put it down to artistic temperament and illness and the way stories grow strange when they are told in whispers. Another part of her, quieter but firmer, could not ignore the way she had seen her own reflection in the glass, nor the damp trace that had looked like a tear on the inside surface. Lydia went on, speaking not as a storyteller but as someone accustomed to cataloging uncomfortable facts. She explained that the letters on Margaret's desk matched references in the archive, drafts Anna Ruth had once addressed to herself, then later to a cousin who never received them. The recurring phrase about the reflection, finishing what I began, appeared in both. Some scholars believed it referred to her fear of aging, of seeing time change her face faster than her work could keep up. Others saw it as the early sign of a mind slipping away. These paintings, Lydia said softly, were her way of freezing rooms, moments, and perhaps versions of herself. But somewhere in the process, she began to feel that the paintings were looking back. That night, after Lydia left with promises of writing a formal authentication report, the house felt even more crowded with unseen things. Harold tried to talk about practicalities, insurance, potential buyers, the possibility of donating a portion of the collection to a museum in exchange for a small lifetime stipend. His mind, as always, went first to the bills stacked quietly in the drawer by the fridge, medical copays, rising utility costs, the creeping anxiety of living longer than their savings. For him, the paintings were a door out of that tight corridor. For Margaret, they had become a mirror she wasn't sure she wanted to stand in front of any longer. They went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Margaret rose and padded softly down the hallway, drawn by a pull she could neither resist nor fully explain. The garage door creaked when she opened it, the sound thin in the cold air. Moonlight slid through the small window, falling in a pale square on the concrete floor. The self-portrait waited where they had left it. For a time she simply stood there, watching it, her breath making small clouds in the air. Then she stepped closer, until her own reflection hovered faintly in the glass covering the painting. The woman inside sat as always by the window, hands folded, eyes lowered. Margaret lifted her hand and slowly pressed her fingertips to the glass. The reflection followed, aligning perfectly. In that moment, she felt an odd, gentle tug, not physical, but something in her chest, as if she were standing on the threshold of someone else's unfinished sentence. Memories rose that were not quite hers, the smell of turpentine and coffee at dawn, the weight of a brush, the quiet ache of knowing your best work might never be fully understood. For a heartbeat, she felt unbearably close to the woman who had painted this room, this window, this waiting figure. She realized then that what frightened her most was not the idea of being possessed, but the possibility of disappearing into someone else's story so completely that her own would be forgotten. She lowered her hand and stepped back. The feeling eased, like a wave receding. The woman in the painting remained still, but the room around her seemed less threatening than it had earlier, more like a museum space than a trap. On a shelf by the wall, the letters rustled faintly in the draft from the door, ordinary paper responding to ordinary air. Margaret understood that she stood at a crossroads. One path meant keeping the paintings here, letting their weight seep deeper into the walls until she no longer trusted what she saw in the mirror each morning. The other meant releasing them to the world, letting professionals carry the burden of meaning and value, and reclaiming her own reflection as just that, her own. In the morning, over a simple breakfast of toast and weak tea, she told Harold her decision. They would not keep the collection, at least not all of it. They would work with Lydia and the museum to place the most important paintings in public care, ensuring that Anna Ruth's story was properly documented and protected. A selection could be consigned through a reputable auction house, with clear provenance and shared oversight. If the works were truly valuable, the proceeds would be enough to secure their remaining years without excess, perhaps with a small cushion to help their granddaughter through college when the time came. She suggested they keep only one painting for themselves, a small coastal scene with no figures at all, just a strip of sand, a low horizon, and a sky full of soft, uncertain light. It had always made her feel peaceful rather than watched. Harold listened, fingers interlaced around his mug, and gradually his shoulders loosened. He had worried she might cling to the paintings out of some private connection he couldn't reach. Instead, she was the one choosing to let go, not out of fear, but out of a quiet understanding that some stories are too large to belong to one living room. If we do this, he said, we do it properly. No secrecy. No bargaining in the shadows. She agreed. Together they called Lydia, then their modest attorney, who had handled their will years earlier. They spoke about contracts, exhibition rights, long-term loans, and the safest way to turn art into security without feeding the kind of people who preferred backroom deals. For viewers who enjoy hearing about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary decisions, how they balance fear, responsibility, and the chance at a second start, this is exactly the point in the story where they lean a little closer, wondering which way the choice will fall. It is the kind of moment that keeps people watching to the very end, leaving comments about what they would have done, clicking the small buttons that help stories like this travel further than any one garage or kitchen ever could. Weeks turned into months. The paintings were photographed, catalogued, and gently wrapped. Conservators examined their surfaces under soft light, noting every crack and pigment. The small coastal scene remained in the Turners' home, hung in the hallway where the afternoon sun touched it briefly each day. The self-portrait, along with several of the strongest pieces, went on long-term loan to a regional museum that agreed to mount a focused exhibition titled Windows of Absence, the last works of Anna Ruth Wells. The museum insisted on including Harold and Margaret's names on the wall text, acknowledging their role in preserving the collection. On opening night, the couple arrived arm in arm, slightly overwhelmed by the polished floors, the gentle buzz of polite conversation, and the way their rather ordinary names looked printed beneath the artists. Visitors moved slowly through the gallery, pausing before each canvas. A young woman stood in front of the self-portrait for a long time, tilting her head the way Margaret once had. "It feels like she's halfway between staying and leaving," the woman said softly to the friend beside her. Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply listened, grateful that the painting's weight was now being shared by eyes that could meet it without carrying its history alone. When she finally stepped up to the self-portrait, the room seemed quieter than it truly was. The woman by the window sat as always, hands folded, eyes lowered. The glass over the canvas reflected the gallery lights and the shifting silhouettes of visitors passing by. Margaret saw herself there too, older now, hair thinner, lines deeper around her mouth, but this time her reflection did not feel trapped or borrowed. It sat lightly on the surface, one of many faces moving across the painting instead of the one meant to complete it. Whatever Anna Ruth had feared when she wrote of her reflection, finishing what I began, belonged to another life, another struggle. Margaret had her own history, her own choices, and she had made one that honored both the dead artist and the living woman who happened to look a bit like her in certain light. Later, back home, the house felt strangely larger without the rows of canvases crowding the rooms. There were still reminders, of course, a letter carefully framed in the study, a catalogue on the coffee table, the small seaside painting glowing softly in the hallway. Their financial situation had improved to something that felt almost like comfort. The heater could run a little longer on cold nights. Harold no longer checked the price of every grocery item twice. There was even talk of a modest trip to the coast, to see water that wasn't painted but real, rolling and indifferent and endlessly moving forward. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, Margaret would stand before the little coastal scene and let her eyes rest on the line between sea and sky. She still thought about reflections, the ones in glass, the ones in memory, the ones in the eyes of people who watched their story online and saw pieces of their own lives in it. Yet she no longer felt pulled into someone else's unfinished canvas. The paintings had found their place. She had found hers. In the end, the miracle was not just that an elderly couple had opened a forgotten storage unit and discovered a lost chapter of art history. It was that they had walked through that strange, echoing gallery of another person's fears and talent and emerged with their own lives intact. A little steadier, a little safer, and still unmistakably their own. The door of Unit 314 had opened onto a room full of silent faces. The door they closed behind them now led to evenings of ordinary light, the steady ticking of a familiar clock, and the comfortable knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing an ordinary person can do is to decide which stories they are willing to carry, and which they are finally ready to set free.